The 12-team college football playoff is here, and it is an absolute disaster. That's what many people are saying, myself included, especially after the first 2 rounds, with pretty much every game being a blowout, except for 1, maybe 2 games. I mean, obviously that Peach Bowl with Arizona State, Texas, that was amazing. But every other game has been just not enjoyable to watch. So how did we get here? Let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly with the 12-team college football playoff. So I'm going to be breaking this up into chapters. So the first chapter we're going to talk about is the inception of this playoff, when it was announced that we were going to be expanding from 4 teams to 12. So starting off with the good, one of the good things was you're expanding the playoff. I think this was it was inevitable at this point, because there were already people that are upset when teams were getting left out. If the number 5 team was being left out, number 6 team. At this point, it just felt like expanding the playoff was going to be a win across the board, mainly for the TV execs that were going to be making more money, probably ESPN. But each of the teams, it seems like it would also allow a chance for you to incorporate automatic qualifiers, which is another good thing that I liked about it. So now you can actually have a team like Florida State guarantee their spot into the playoff in 2023, rather than having the committee have to say, are they the best 4 teams? Well, now they could earn their way in, because this playoff was able to have the top 5 conference champions automatically get a spot into this playoff. So that is a good sign. And then the last good sign would say that the group of 5 now gets 1 spot, or at least they're guaranteed a spot. They could get more. They probably never will. So they are given 1 spot, which isn't bad. So I will say those are the good parts. As you can tell, that's a pretty short list. So let's talk about the bads. So first, you're going to 12 teams, which I already thought was a pretty aggressive expansion. Like, going from 4 to 12 is tripling the size of the field, and you're basically adding an extra 2 rounds to this playoff. Like, I don't mind expanding the playoff at all. I actually preferred it, but going from 4 to 12 is kind of radical, because I think going to 6 I would have been happy with, going to 8 or even 10 I would have been okay with, but just going to 12 just seemed kind of crazy. And it's almost like it puts you in a place where you can no longer, they can only keep expanding it at this point. There's no way they're going to bring it back. They're not going to go to 8 teams. They're only going to keep expanding it more. So the fact that they made this huge jump right away just basically guarantees that we're going to be getting a 14 or 16 team playoff soon, because more teams are going to feel like they deserve a spot in, and they're never going to retract at this point, because again, once you open that door, you can't close it. So it's like Pandora's box. So they have to just deal with it. And now we're at the point now where a 12-team playoff is probably the smallest playoff we'll ever have for the next 20 years, I think. So that is definitely a bad sign. Another bad sign is you have 5 conference champions that are guaranteed a spot, but there's 4 buys. So it automatically doesn't add up properly. Like, at this point, when the playoff was initially designed, the 12-team playoff, it seemed like they put in 5 conference champions as a way to appease every Power 5 conference. Like, hey, all of the Power 5 conference champions will get in. You may not be guaranteed a bye, but at least you'll get in. The problem is between the time when this playoff was announced in 2022 and when it was actually implemented in 2024, one of the power conferences exploded. The Pac-12 is now the Pac-2. Obviously, they're expanding again, but they're not really a power conference anymore. You saw the rise of the Big Ten and the SEC as super conferences, with the Big 12 and ACC still seen as respected power conferences above the Group of 5. I guess they're now called the Group of 6 because the Pac-12 kind of demoted itself. So now you have 4 power conferences and 5 spots, but 4 buys. So this is where a bunch of BS started happening. Again, we'll talk about it in the selection, but that is definitely a bad sign. And then we have to talk about the ugly. The ugly is that the College Football Playoff Committee is still a thing. It's still going to be the one that decides the seeding and still decides the rankings. So they didn't really change the process at all. They just expanded the playoff, added buys and qualifiers, but they didn't change how the teams are going to be ranked. It's still going to be a bunch of people behind closed doors saying whatever they want, ranking however they want. When I found out that was going to be the way that they're picking the teams, I was like, this system's going to be screwed up no matter what. So that is chapter 1. So let's talk about the next chapter, which would be the selection of these 12 teams. So starting off with the good parts of this selection process where they got to the final 12 teams, one thing I will give the committee props is really the way that they were being consistent throughout the final weeks before we got to the final 12 teams. Towards the end, you started to see, which teams were going to be placed where based off of how they were playing throughout the season. You weren't seeing a lot of flip-flops. Now, obviously, when a team lost, they would get dropped, or if a team had a huge win, they may bump up a little bit. But if there wasn't many big reasons for change, they weren't flip-flopping teams. Like, you weren't getting a 2023 Florida State where they jumped from 4 to 6, even though they were still the same team from the week prior. So stuff like that, you really don't see, which, again, I will give credit to the committee for. And I think that's really it when it comes to the selection. Other than personally, I do think they got the right teams in, but that's my opinion, so I don't really want to consider that a good part. So let's talk about the bad. The bad is the seeding. I think the seeding is really stupid, and this breaks down the fundamental design of this playoff, and that is basically you're getting teams that, the teams that are getting automatic buys to conference champions, I think is really stupid, because the thing is like, you have a team like Arizona State, which is coming out of the Big 12, which is a relatively weaker conference, you would say. Obviously, you've seen how the Bulls play, but you would think Arizona State, they're probably not one of the better teams. Like, you would think a team like Ohio State or Penn State or whatever would probably deserve it, especially when you have the committee that's making these subjective rankings. So it basically forces the committee to have their hand tied behind their back, because that basically means you can only put these specific teams in the top 4, and then they can do the best 4 teams. So it almost creates two different types of rankings. There's ranking the conference champions for who gets the buys, and then who is that 5th conference champion that just gets, placed wherever. And then you actually have the teams that they can put in based on, however selection process they want. I think that's really stupid. And another thing that really makes it stupid is the fact is the top 25 rankings are not the same as the seeding, which immediately adds a bunch of confusion, especially to people who haven't been studying the science of the 12-team college football playoff, because you'll have a team like Clemson who finished 16 or something, or not even that high. They get placed at 12, which makes it doesn't make sense. But that's because of the seeding versus the rankings. I think that's a bad thing, because it invites a bunch of criticism. You're not putting in the teams based off of how good they are. Like, you're not seeding them based on how good they are. You're basically putting them there because they win their conference championship. Again, that's just my personal opinion. I think that if you win your conference, you should be guaranteed a spot. But I do think that even if you win your conference, you shouldn't just be given a bye. And one thing that was interesting too is, like, Clemson, they were eligible to get a bye when they won the ACC, but since they weren't the top 4, they could have been placed anywhere. They weren't even guaranteed a home game. Like, that's kind of weird too. Like, you would think, like, Clemson could have, this is what Clemson's possibilities. They could have had a bye, they could have hosted a playoff game, or they could have gone on the road. So those are the 3 possibilities of winning their conference. That's a really weird, it's stupid how that's how it works. Like, in the NFL, when you win your division, you're either the number 1 seed and you get a bye, or you're hosting a playoff game. It's simple. The way that this playoff was working is not very simple. So, so that's the bad in my opinion. And then the ugly is, it's really the reaction. I think social media has been really, they've been really vile when it comes to these rankings, because everyone keeps looking at, what matters and how they rank these teams. Like, oh, do schedules matter? Do wins matter? Do losses matter? Who do you play matter? Like, stuff like that. Like, you were even seeing people in, like, the media, like the big broadcast giants saying that, oh, these wins shouldn't matter, or these losses shouldn't matter. And it becoming the debate between, oh, well, SMU was an 11-2 team, but who did they beat? And then you have Alabama who says, oh, well, we beat Georgia. But then Alabama haters will say, oh, well, they lost to Vanderbilt and they lost by 21 to Oklahoma. So then you have this big old fight on social media, and people were using all these different arguments, and because we don't still have the same college football playoff committee that is making these decisions, we're still going to have this kind of outrage. Of course, it was Alabama that got left out, is why there was a lot of people that are upset, because Alabama's brand name is at its highest. Now, of course, Nick Saban isn't the coach anymore. Best believe if Nick Saban was the coach, I don't think that was going to happen. I really think that if Nick Saban was still the coach, SMU would have gotten snubbed, in my opinion, because Nick Saban, even after he wasn't even the coach anymore, he went on a whole rant about it afterwards. Now, he's a fan, he supports his team, I get it, but then you just had all these people from the SEC, and you had everyone else saying, oh, well, this team deserved to get in, this team deserved to get in. It was just a whole mess. So that was the ugly parts of it. It did make for some interesting discussions, but it was mainly people yelling at each other, throwing names, and overall was not a bright spot in the college football community. Now let's go to the games themselves. Let's start off with the first round. Okay, so let's talk about the first round, and I'll be honest, I don't have many good things to say. So the first good thing is, well, the games are being played on campus. This is a massive W for college football. I love that playoff games are being played on campus. You're seeing matchups that you would never see around this time of the year. I mean, you had Penn State playing SMU, you had Ohio State hosting Tennessee, like in December. Like, these are really cool venues, really cool environments. Clemson, Texas, like those are really sick. And it started off with Indiana, Notre Dame, and this is where we get into the bad. The bad was, well, the games. The games weren't really competitive at all. The entire first round, every game was basically a blowout. The closest game was Clemson and Texas, which many people thought was going to be the biggest blowout. It was the biggest spread. But I'll start off with Indiana and Notre Dame. And this kind of shows that college football, although there is a lot more parity, it's just that the teams at the top that recruit the best are still going to be really, really good. And you have teams like Notre Dame, who is a team that they have more talent than Indiana. And Indiana is a good team. They did beat up on a lot of smaller schools, but when they did have to play against a team that had equal or more talent, like Ohio State, they kind of got beat up. Like, the game wasn't really that close. They tried to keep it close. They were able to score right away, but those are the games that you need the better team to have a full-on collapse for you to beat. It's almost like TCU beating Michigan in the playoff a few years ago. It wasn't really TCU winning the game, it was more Michigan losing it. Now, I'm not taking credit away from TCU. They won the game, but what I'm saying is that Michigan in that game was making a lot of mistakes, and TCU was able to capitalize on it. Something that happened in the first round of the games is the teams that were playing on the road, they were playing on the road in these tough environments, but they're playing against teams with more talent, and that just makes it the margin of error much, much, much smaller for these teams. You basically have to play a perfect game. I mean, look at Clemson. Cade Klubnik had an insane game. I think he had probably the most passing yards on Texas in their entire season up to that point, and they still lost by 10 points. So Cade Klubnik played an incredible game, and they still weren't able to win because Texas just played a decent game. They didn't play to lose the game. They played, and they played well. And then, yeah, going back to Notre Dame and Indiana, Notre Dame just ran their normal offense and were just able to do whatever they want. Indiana couldn't do anything. The only way Indiana was going to beat Notre Dame is if Notre Dame had a total collapse on the field, and they didn't. Same thing with SMU and Penn State, except SMU collapsed immediately, so allowed the game to be a blowout from like right away. When you have the underdog throw 2 pick sixes, there is no way you're going to win the game. I don't think there's ever been a time where a quarterback who is an underdog on the road throws 2 pick sixes and still wins the game. Like, tell me where that actually has happened in real life. Usually the way it works for an underdog to win is there usually has to be something that allows you to spark some sort of motivation and go on this kind of run. This never really happened in the first round. There was a little spark for Clemson at some point, but it's still, like, Texas was able to shut the door on them because they just couldn't stop the run. And then you have Tennessee and Ohio State. Now, personally, this was a glorious hate watch because I was very I was tired of all the SEC people saying that SEC should have 20 teams in the playoff or something, because up to that point, all these games were blowouts. And then you had a mighty SEC team walk into the shoe and get absolutely curb stomped by Ohio State. Now, we will find out that this Ohio State team they're pretty good, but they were the 8th seed. So the fact is like, this game could have been played in Neyland if they decided to swap the rankings. I still think Ohio State was going to win. I think this Ohio State team is unstoppable at this point. So that would be the bad part. The games weren't really competitive. Now we have to go into the ugly. So the ugly, again, is going to be the fan reactions. This is where people were saying that wins don't matter and that these games aren't competitive and that we should put in teams that would be able to compete and stuff. Like, this is where people were started saying that Indiana shouldn't be in. Indiana's like spot in the playoff was never in question until they got blown out by Notre Dame. And same thing with SMU. Once SMU got blown out by Penn State, who is also a pretty good team. These are all good teams, by the way. They blow out their opponents. People think they think less of Penn State and Notre Dame beating up on their opponents. They think of, oh, well, these teams shouldn't have been in the playoff. And this is where it becomes an issue, because like in the NFL, every team earns their spots in based on records and objective data. They don't pull up strength of schedules. They'll pull on like opponent records, but it's all based off of wins and losses. It's not based off of, oh, well, how well did you play and how this? Now, I will say you can't do the same NFL model because schedules aren't really created equal in college football, because the best team and the worst team in college football, the gap is way bigger than it is between the best and worst team in the NFL. I completely get that. I completely understand that. So if you're someone that's already typing a comment, I get it. So I do understand why some of these metrics need to come into place. But you also have to understand that if people decide to go in a direction that you don't agree with, I think there could be two like correct answers. There isn't 100% right. This isn't a black and white issue. It is obviously like a gray. It's a gradient. It's like picking the best option. But again, is when the playoff committee says we want the quote best teams, it allows people to say, well, if you get blown out, you must not be the best team. But again, we need to talk about the 4-team playoff, and that blowouts were happening when there was only semifinals. So even though the first round did have mainly blowouts, it wasn't a good start. It was not a good start. And we have had blowouts in the past, but I think some people were just thinking that, maybe because there's 12 teams and that there's more opportunities, it would give opportunities for an upset to happen. But so far, that's not the case. So yeah, definitely the ugly part would just be the social media outcry. I'm pulling it up again because just people were just saying so much stuff about how this team shouldn't have got in, this team shouldn't have got in, and then Tennessee got blown out, and then a bunch of SEC fanboys kind of shut up for a little bit. So honestly, I will say Ohio State did do a good thing, because if Tennessee somehow upset Ohio State, there would have been like cries to change the playoff immediately that no ACC team should get in, or SEC deserves to have 6 teams, because it started becoming a fight between the Big Ten and the SEC. People were saying, oh, the Big Ten doesn't belong with the SEC. So after all the games were settled, people started to chill out a little bit, and we started to look forward to the quarterfinals and see, okay, let's see how these quarterfinals set up. So let's go into that. Okay, so talking about the quarterfinals, so now we are moving to traditional bowl sites. So I will say this is a good thing for one reason. This now involves, the quarterfinals and semifinals now involve all the New Year's 6 bowl games, which means that all of them are now kind of on equal footing, because in the 4-team college football playoff, only 2 of the New Year's 6 bowls would be considered a playoff game. And then the rest of them would just be considered like New Year's 6 bowls, but since there was no playoff implications, they were just seen as a tier below. They weren't seen as, a bowl worth playing in. That's where you started seeing a bunch of opt-outs. So the fact is now all of these New Year's 6 bowl games, whether they're quarterfinals or semifinal games, they all actually matter. Another good thing that I like is I do think that these are also swapping between quarterfinals and semifinals. I think except for the Rose Bowl, because I know the Rose Bowl is tied to January 1st because the Rose Bowl committee, the Rose Tournament of Roses or whatever they are, they're very adamant about playing their games at 1 on January 1st at 2 p.m. Pacific, just so that they could have the sunset. I get it. I just think it's kind of pretentious in my opinion. Anyways, so I do think with exception to the Rose Bowl, they'll be swapping out, which I think is cool. I think it allows some variation, and I do think that's good. While I do think having games on campus would be awesome, I do think this is a fair, compromise, in my opinion. So I will say that was a good thing. I'm not going to say it's a big L. Now, one thing that was going to be interesting, and now we'll go into the bad, is, well, now you have two teams who kind of didn't really deserve to get a bye, but because the way the system was developed, they did get byes. So you had Boise State and Penn State. Boise State getting the bye because they were the third highest ranked conference champion, which was crazy. They weren't even number 4 out of 5. They were the third highest, and they were also the group of 5 champions. So they were able to get in for 2 reasons. It would have gone in as a group of 5 champ anywhere in the bracket, and then they able to steal a bye because they were the third highest ranked conference champion. And they were to play Penn State. Now, they were playing in the Fiesta Bowl, which Boise State has had some... they've actually played pretty well in the Fiesta Bowl the past few times they've played there. However, in this case, you could just tell that this was just a matchup that wasn't going in the favor of Penn State. I do think that Boise State did have a valiant effort. They definitely tried. But you could just tell that Penn State just had so much more talent. And this did make me feel kind of pessimistic for the future of this playoff, because even though that you have these teams like Boise State that went 12-1, they went head-to-head with Oregon, it just comes to a point where at the end of the season, you kind of know what these teams are, and especially when they're a team that is just solely focused around one player, you could just take that person away and force them to completely change their identity. And that's what Penn State did. They tried to take away Ashton Genty's ability to run, and they did with quite a bit of success. Now, they weren't able to completely shut him down. I think he still had over 100 yards rushing, but they were able to take away those explosive runs and force Boise State's quarterback, Madsen, to kind of win the game with his arm. And I'll be honest, he played a pretty damn good game. And he had some good plays as well, but then he also had some mistakes where they had to just force throw the ball a few times, and they were able to throw a few interceptions. And then Boise's kicker, he missed a few kicks. There was a few turnovers. The thing is when you're a huge underdog, you can't afford to make these mistakes. And that's what Boise State was doing. They kept making mistakes. They were missing kicks. You can't do that when you're playing a juggernaut like Penn State. And unfortunately, the game was quite a bit lopsided. It did get close at times. I will say it was the closest game up to that point, but Penn State was able to roll away in the end. So that was the first game. And then we go into the second game, which is the Peach Bowl. Now, I will say, this was going to be a bad. I'm taking it back to good. We're moving it back to the good side. This game was an absolute banger, because I was already thinking about this, how I was going to put this game in the bad, because I had to go to a cooking class with my girlfriend when this game was like, I think it was like a 10-point game, like in the fourth quarter. I was like, oh, this game's over. I somehow checked the score. They're in overtime. So yeah, I'm moving it back to the good. So I'm flipping the script. This Peach Bowl was awesome. Cam Skattebo is a beast. I mean, people are saying that he should have been over Genty in the Heisman ranking. Honestly, like, I don't think that's the case. You kind of have to look at the whole season, but he really put the team on his back, and that was like MJ's flu game, like, version in college football, because apparently he was sick too. Like, dude was doing everything. And also, Levitt, who was the quarterback for Arizona State, he reminds me a lot of Jordan Travis. So I think that Arizona State is going to be in really good hands for the next year or two. But wow, that was an awesome game, how Arizona State was able to come back. I mean, I think Kenny Dillingham is a beast of a coach. And overall, like, that's how an underdog can almost win the game. Of course, Texas ended up winning the game with an interception in double overtime. And you have to give props to Texas for not totally collapsing. I mean, Arizona State had some insane plays. Like, everything was starting to click for them, and Texas just had to just end the game. And then one thing that was a bad, I had to go back to the bad. There was a missed targeting call when I think it was like 3rd and long, and one of Arizona State's players got blown up. And In my opinion, I think that's textbook targeting, but people were saying like you can't make that call because it would have done all this stuff. Personally, like I have an interesting take when it comes to targeting, because I do think that there needs to be some sort of rule against it. I think it's like in the NFL, it's like unnecessary roughness, like where if you just blow somebody up. That was textbook targeting in terms of the way the rules work in the NCAA. But I do understand why they didn't make that call, because imagine like the outcry that would come if like Arizona State won because of that. And especially because it was a long pass. Like they weren't going to get the first down if he caught the ball. So I get it, but I do think you have to make the call, though. You have to make the call because that's what the rules say. But I think the refs were kind of just doing the late game, don't call the penalty type stuff unless you're like the Chiefs or whatever in the Super Bowl and you call the pass interference. So that was interesting. That was definitely going back to the bad. And then we have to go on to, we're gonna stick to the bad, and we have to go to the Rose Bowl, where, oh my goodness, this game was an absolute disappointment. This was by far the most disappointing game of the playoff. More disappointing than SMU and Penn State, more disappointing than Indiana and Notre Dame. This was by far the biggest disappointment in the playoff, and I think it will be for the entire rest of the tournament, because you got the #1 overall seed Oregon having to go up against the absolute juggernaut is Ohio State, because Ohio State was the 8th seed, which again is very weird. And again, we talk about the seeding, because the fact is Ohio State, they were the 8th seed? That was kind of crazy, right? So now they had to feed into Oregon's side of the bracket, and Ohio State just on fire, and they completely lit up Oregon. And it was 34-0 before the end of the half. Of course, Oregon tried to make it close, but this game was an absolute blowout. It was like Oregon did get a few garbage time scores to keep it within, I think it was like a 20-point win by Ohio State. But this game was never close. Not even once. Like the game was over within 5 minutes. Like that's how bad this game was. And it's like, this is the #1 seed. Like, I don't really know what to take from that. But more to say, like, I don't know. I really don't know what to take from. Like, there's not much the playoff could do. Like, the committee couldn't do anything like else. Like, Oregon was the only undefeated team. Now, I will say, you could make we could have a discussion based off of how the seeding was worked, because if you look at Penn State has a pretty easy run. They had to play SMU, who barely snuck into the playoff, and then they were fed in to play Boise State. So, like, that's a pretty weak schedule. So that's where I think the seeding definitely needs to be changed, because the fact is that Penn State was feeding into Boise State, and then Ohio State had to play Oregon. Now, I think it was like Oregon had to play Ohio State. They're like, why couldn't we play Boise State or something? Why couldn't we play Indiana? They had to play, like, Ohio State being at A was such an under seeding, but I guess that made sense because they did just come off a pretty bad loss to Michigan. But that was just insane. But that was, I think, putting the nail in the coffin for the fact that seeding needs to be changed. Now, the Sugar Bowl was the second Goliath versus Goliath matchup in the quarterfinals. In the first two games, we had Penn State and Boise State, where Boise State was the David versus the Goliath of Penn State, and the game kind of went accordingly. And then we had the David of Arizona State almost beat Texas, the Goliath of Texas. That was really the closest game we had in the entire quarterfinals. And then we had our first Goliath versus Goliath matchup in the Rose Bowl, where Ohio State absolutely destroyed Oregon. So that first matchup, and that was supposed to be the best game of the playoff. Like, the winner of that game was expected to go all the way, but Oregon didn't even show up. So then we had this final matchup between Notre Dame and Georgia, and a lot of people were curious, how would Georgia play without starting quarterback? Because after Georgia defeated Texas in the SEC Championship, and then when they got the number 2 seed, they did announce that Carson Beck was going to miss the entire playoff and then declared for the draft. So they were going to be running with their backup quarterback the entire way. Now, this was interesting because if we remember last year, Florida State got left out of the playoff because of Jordan Travis. They didn't look good after Jordan Travis went out. Now, the way it worked then is that there was 2 games between when Jordan Travis went out and the selection, so they got to see that, okay, this Florida State team isn't that very good. But with Georgia, he went out in the SEC title game, but also they did end up winning the SEC, so they basically were guaranteed a spot. And of course, I don't think you would have put in Boise State or Arizona State above them, but it just kind of showed that the seeding is kind of wonky, that the 2 through 4 seeds were pretty bad. I mean, Oregon absolutely deserved their number 1 seed, but Georgia, not even having their quarterback, they did end up winning the SEC title. But when they played Notre Dame, this game was not really close at all. Like, they couldn't do anything on offense. Their only scoring touchdown was off of a blown coverage from Notre Dame. Notre Dame completely controlled this game. It wasn't really close at all. I know some people are saying that this game was closer than the score predicted and that they had a few chances. I guess you could say they did. Georgia still had a bunch of talent, but they couldn't stop Notre Dame. They couldn't stop Riley Leonard. Like, half the time you know that he was just going to run the ball, and they still couldn't stop them. So the fact that Georgia was a first round exit didn't surprise me as much as Oregon, but it still was a pretty big disappointment. And then we got to move on to the ugly, and that is, what is up with these buys? The top 1 through 4 seeds all lost their opening game. Now you could make the number 3 and number 4 seeds, Boise State and Arizona State, they were teams that only had those seeds because of how the format is set up. So you could make an argument like, okay, them losing their games, that's fine. They weren't even favored. But Oregon and Georgia, they were the number 1 and number 2 seeds regardless of how this was set up. If it was just the top 4 seeds or the top 12 seeds ranked, they would have put them at number 1 and number 2. Now, again, if people knew about what Carson Beck was going through, I don't know if they would have put them at 2. But again, these were the number 1 and number 2 seeds, and they both lost their games pretty convincingly. So that is definitely not a good sign for the playoff in terms of the buys, because every team that got a bye lost their game. Now, I will say that a lot of people are saying that this shows that teams that have buys have a disadvantage, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. I just think that just the way that the bracket's set up, all these matchups were all in favor of the team that was playing the team that was at a bye. Like, for example, Boise State had to play Penn State, and Penn State was just a better team, and they were favored. Same thing with Texas going to play Arizona State. They were a better team. The game did go to double overtime, so it was, Arizona State was a hot team, and they were able to play really good. And then Ohio State is probably the hottest team in the country right now, and they're by far one of the most talented teams in the country. They spent a lot of money on this roster, and they had to go play Oregon, who was the number 1 seed. So Oregon had a pretty bad draw. And then you have Notre Dame, who pretty much handled Indiana. They got to go play a pretty beat down Georgia team that was out their starting quarterback. So really just the matchups worked in favor of these quote underdog seeds, even though only one team that was the higher seed was actually I think all the favorites won, because I'm pretty sure Notre Dame was favored as a lower seed, Ohio State was favored as a lower seed, and then same with Penn State and Texas. So all the number 1 and 4 seeds, 1 through 4, they were all underdogs in their matchups. That just shows that the system is broken. That's where I think it is a disaster when it comes to the seeding. That is the most ugly part about this. And I will say this, I'm going to bring back the good real quick as we're finishing up this video, because I know it's pretty long. The final thing that I would say is good is that I feel like this is the strongest Final Four we've had really ever, because you can think that all these teams that have gotten to this point, all of them have played 2 games, and they've all won them pretty convincingly, except for maybe Texas. Even though Texas is a pretty talented team, and I do think they have the ability to win it all, they're the weakest team, surprisingly, is crazy to me. Now, if I had to do a power ranking of all of the 4 remaining teams, I would go Ohio State, easily number 1. I mean, they blew out both the teams. They blew out Tennessee, that was pretty damn good, and then they blew out the number 1 team in the country by 20 points. They were up by 34 almost by the end of the half. So they're easily the number 1 team. And then I'm going to put Notre Dame at 2. Now, the reason why I'm putting Notre Dame at 2 is because they were able to handle Georgia pretty handedly, because, I mean, even though Georgia didn't have their starting quarterback, it was not really that close. They also did control Indiana, which did have a pretty decent offense. They did have the talent advantage. And then right behind them, I'm going to put Penn State. Penn State had probably the easiest run so far, so that's why I can't give them that much credit. They had to play SMU, which snuck their way into the playoff, and then they got to play Boise State, who was another team, again, really good team with, some talent, like, Ashton Genty, of course, but once they shut him down, the game was pretty much over. And then lastly, I'm going to put Texas, which I know Texas, it seems like they should be higher, but I just don't have a lot of faith. They played the number 12 seed Clemson. They didn't have the strongest matchup in the strongest performance in the first round. And then in the quarterfinals, they blew a big lead to Arizona State, almost letting them win the game. So even though Texas still has a lot of talent, I think all these teams have the capability of winning it all. It seems like, when we had the 14 playoff, there was always that odd team out. The fact that Texas might be this odd team out is awesome. I think these final four matchup is going to be absolute cinema. But I also think the fact that these teams have kind of earned their way here, I think it brings a lot more validation to these four teams. So while I do think that the first two rounds of the college football playoff has been a disaster on the field, I do think that the teams that we did end up getting, I would say, are the best teams. These are the best teams. They earned their way in, and pretty convincingly, except for maybe Texas. But again, they won their games. So that's going to be it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was my part 2 to my playoff video. If you did like it, be sure to let me know. Let me know what your thoughts on the 12-team playoff. So yeah, just to sum it up short, I think up to the Final Four, it's been a disaster, but I do think these semifinal games are going to be awesome. So hopefully the final 2 rounds of this playoff are going to be, make up for the rest of it. And I do think, let me know if you want me to make a video on how I would fix the playoff, because I do have some thoughts. But that's it, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about this playoff so far. But other than that, this has been Jagnol, and I will see you guys next time.